People often ask me that question with a smile. Can you tell us a fun story about a world leader you've met? And I understand why. We tend to see world leaders through the lens of podiums, headlines, and history books. We imagine seriousness, strategy, and state dinners with carefully arranged seating charts. But here's what I've learned. Behind every title is a human being. When you spend time around world leaders, you quickly realize something that surprises many people watching from afar. The title enters the room before they do. The expectations, the history, the symbolism, all of it arrives first. And yet, once the doors close and the cameras are ushered out, what remains is not a title. We tend to imagine leaders as larger-than-life figures, defined entirely by the weight of their office. We see them framed by flags, standing behind podiums, speaking in carefully measured sentences. But leadership does not erase humanity. In fact, the most effective leaders I've met are deeply aware of their own humanity and the humanity of others. I remember walking into bilateral meetings where the stakes were high and the agendas were dense, security briefings, economic negotiations, strategic alliances. On paper, everything looked formal and immovable. But before the meeting even began, there would often be small, telling exchanges. Someone asking about a family member, someone joking about the weather, someone admitting they hadn't slept much because of travel delays. Those moments are not insignificant. They are reminders that the person across the table also carries responsibilities beyond the headlines, that they have pressures, advisors, doubts, and yes, even insecurities. Leadership is not an armor that shields someone from ordinary emotions. It simply places those emotions under extraordinary scrutiny. There's a quiet power in recognizing that. When you understand that even the most influential figures are navigating personal challenges while making public decisions, it changes how you see authority. It becomes less about mystique and more about responsibility, less about perfection and more about perseverance. I've seen leaders pause before answering a difficult question, not because they didn't know the policy, but because they understood the human consequences behind it. I've seen them soften when discussing their children or their communities. I've seen moments of vulnerability that would never make it into official transcripts, but that revealed the depth of their character. And here's what's important. Humanity is not weakness. It is grounding. The best leaders I've encountered are those who remain connected to their own lived experiences. They remember what it feels like to worry about family, to make mistakes, to learn hard lessons. That connection allows them to approach complex issues with empathy rather than arrogance. When we strip leaders of their humanity in our minds, we do two things. First, we create unrealistic expectations. We expect flawlessness, constant certainty, superhuman endurance. And second, we distance ourselves from leadership itself. We begin to believe that those roles are reserved for a rare breed of person, someone fundamentally different from us. But the truth is far more empowering. Leadership is practiced by human beings, imperfect, evolving, learning human beings. I've watched world leaders laugh at themselves after mispronouncing a word in another language. I've seen them quietly ask aides for clarification before stepping to a podium. I've heard them admit in private conversations that a decision weighed heavily on them long after it was made. These glimpses matter. They remind us that strength and sensitivity can coexist. That authority does not require emotional detachment, that the capacity to care deeply is often what drives the most thoughtful decisions. And let's be honest, when leaders forget their humanity, that's when problems arise, when power becomes isolating, when titles overshadow empathy, when distance replaces connection. History has shown us the cost of leadership divorced from humility. Humanity keeps power accountable. It encourages listening instead of dictating. It fosters collaboration instead of dominance. It opens space for compromise instead of rigidity. In high-level diplomacy, the breakthroughs rarely happen because one side overwhelms the other. They happen because someone recognizes the person across the table, because they understand the pressures that leader faces back home, because they acknowledge cultural sensitivities, because they treat each other not just as representatives of governments, but as individuals trying to serve their people. That awareness builds trust. And trust, even at the highest levels of global politics, begins with something very simple: recognizing shared human experience. So when people ask for a fun story about a world leader, What often stands out to me isn't just the humor, it's the humanity behind it. A reminder that even in rooms where history is unfolding, the individuals shaping it are still navigating the same emotions, responsibilities, and personal connections that define all of us. The title may command attention, but it is the humanity that commands respect. When you work in environments where every word is measured and every gesture is analyzed, you might assume there is no room for humor. After all, the issues on the table are often grave: national security, economic stability, humanitarian crises. But what I've learned over the years is that humor doesn't disappear in high stakes moments. In fact, met in times, it becomes essential. There is a misconception that seriousness and strength are the same thing. That to lead effectively, you must remain stern at all times. But the truth is, the ability to find lightness in heavy moments is not a distraction from leadership. It is often a sign of confidence within it. I remember attending an international summit where tensions were running particularly high. Negotiations had stretched late into the evening. Translators were tired. Advisors were whispering urgently behind their principals. Everyone in the room understood that the outcome would carry significant consequences. At one point during a pause while documents were being revised, a microphone unexpectedly picked up a private aside between two leaders. Instead of the serious policy debate everyone expected, it captured a quiet joke about how none of us had seen daylight in hours. The room erupted in restrained laughter, the kind that is half relief, half recognition, and something shifted. The tension softened just enough for people to breathe. Shoulders relaxed. The atmosphere became more collaborative. The humor didn't undermine the seriousness of the work. It reminded us that we were all human beings navigating pressure together. Humor, in those moments, is not about entertainment. It's about connection. When leaders share a laugh, even briefly, they create space for trust. And trust is the currency of diplomacy. Without it, negotiations become rigid. With it, compromise becomes possible. I have seen humor diffuse misunderstandings before they escalated. A misinterpreted phrase, a cultural nuance that landed awkwardly, a scheduling mishap that could have caused offense. Sometimes a well-timed light comment acknowledges the awkwardness and moves everyone forward without defensiveness. That requires emotional intelligence. It requires reading the room, understand tone, knowing when levity will build bridges and when it would be inappropriate. The best leaders possess that instinct. They understand that humor, used wisely, can be a stabilizing force. There was another occasion during a bilateral visit when a carefully planned outdoor ceremony was suddenly interrupted by unexpected weather. The wind disrupted, prepared remarks, papers scattered, and the choreography unraveled. For a brief moment, you could see the frustration on everyone's faces. And then the host leader smiled and remarked that at least the weather was bipartisan in its unpredictability. The crowd laughed. The mood transformed. What could have been remembered as a logistical failure became a shared story. These moments matter because they reveal resilience. When leaders can adapt with grace, when they can acknowledge imperfection without panic, they demonstrate steadiness, and steadiness inspires confidence. In high-pressure environments, people look to leaders for cues. If a leader reacts to minor disruptions with visible irritation, the anxiety in the room multiplies. If they respond with calm perspective, sometimes even gentle humor, they signal that the situation is manageable. That kind of composure strengthens negotiations. It reassures allies. It stabilizes teams. But humor also serves another purpose. It reminds leaders not to take themselves too seriously, even when their responsibilities are serious. Power can create isolation. Titles can create distance. Laughter, when authentic, closes that gap. I've seen leaders exchange stories about travel mishaps, language blunders, even childhood memories during breaks in formal talks. Those stories don't appear in official communiques, but they lay the groundwork for cooperation. They humanize individuals who might otherwise remain symbolic figures across a negotiating table. And here's something important. NT, humor does not trivialize responsibility. It coexists with it. Some of the most thoughtful, disciplined leaders I've met also possess a sharp wit. They understand that maintaining perspective prevents burnout, that acknowledging absurdity in complex bureaucracies keeps frustration from festering, that laughter, even brief, can reset focus. In our own lives, we experience the same truth. When we face challenges at work, in our families, in our communities, the ability to step back and smile can restore clarity. It doesn't diminish the problem, it strengthens our capacity to address it. In global leadership, where the stakes are magnified, that capacity becomes even more vital. Humor, used wisely, builds bridges where attention might otherwise build walls. It creates moments of shared humanity in rooms filled with strategic calculation. It reminds everyone present that while the responsibilities are enormous, the people carrying them are still human. And sometimes, a shared laugh is the first step toward shared progress. If there is one thing I have learned from years of sitting across tables, walking through receiving lines, and engaging in conversations that stretch long after the cameras leave, it is this. Leadership is built on relationships. Policies matter. Strategy matters. Preparation matters. But relationships are what allow all of those things to function. From the outside, diplomacy can look like a series of formal events, handshakes in front of flags, carefully worded statements, structured agendas with time limits down to the minute. And yes, those moments are important. They signal unity, they project stability, they communicate intention, but the real work of leadership often happens in quieter spaces. It happens in the in-between moments, in the brief walk from one meeting room to another, in the few minutes before a formal dinner begins, in a side bar conversation while aides shuffle papers. Those are the moments when leaders speak more candidly, when they test ideas, when they express concerns that might not yet be ready for microphones. Trust is rarely built under bright lights. It is built through consistency over time. I have seen negotiations stall because leaders did not know each other well enough to interpret tone or intention. A phrase meant as firmness was received as hostility. A pause meant as thoughtfulness was interpreted as reluctance. Without relationship, ambiguity creates suspicion. But when leaders have invested time in understanding each other, when they have spoken about their backgrounds, their values, even their families, those same ambiguities are interpreted differently. There is context, there is goodwill, there is room to clarify rather than react. That doesn't mean everyone becomes friends. Diplomacy is not about personal affinity. It is about mutual respect. It is about understanding the pressures each leader faces domestically. It is about recognizing cultural differences and historical sensitivities. It is about knowing what motivates the person across the table. I remember working on a particularly complex issue that required months of coordination. The policy details were intricate. The political pressures were intense on both sides. We could have relied solely on formal exchanges, position papers, official statements, structured negotiations, but progress truly accelerated only after we had invested in relationship. There were conversations about shared challenges, honest admissions about domestic constraints, moments of vulnerability about what success or failure would mean politically back home. That transparency did not weaken the negotiation. It strengthened it. It allowed each side to craft solutions that were realistic rather than theoretical. Relationships create flexibility. When trust exists, leaders are more willing to explore creative solutions. They are more willing to give the benefit of the doubt. They are more likely to pick up the phone directly instead of escalating misunderstandings through public channels. And sometimes those direct calls prevent crises from deepening. There were occasions when a headline threatened to unravel months of work, a public statement taken out of context, a media report exaggerating tension. In those moments, because relationship had already been established, it was possible to reach out personally and clarify intentions before narratives hardened. That kind of access cannot be improvised. It must be cultivated. It requires time. It requires patience. It requires showing up consistently. And it requires listening. Truly listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak. Listening is one of the most underestimated tools of leadership. When a leader feels heard, even if agreement is not immediate, the tone of the conversation shifts. Defensiveness decreases. Collaboration becomes more likely. I have seen leaders who entered meetings prepared to assert their positions firmly, but after feeling genuinely heard, They became open to compromise, not because they were persuaded by pressure, but because they felt respected. Respect builds bridges, and bridges are what allow policy to move forward. We often focus on grand speeches and sweeping agreements, but behind those visible milestones are countless conversations that shape them. Moments when two leaders decided to trust each other's word, moments when relationship outweighed rhetoric. This lesson extends far beyond global politics. In our own communities, workplaces, and families, progress is rarely achieved through authority alone. It is built through connection, through reliability, through shared understanding. When relationships are strong, disagreements become manageable rather than destructive. Leadership, at any level, is relational. It is not about dominance. It is about influence grounded in trust. And trust is earned not in a single dramatic moment, but in 100 small interactions over time. That is why I value the informal conversations as much as the formal negotiations. Because often, it is in those human exchanges that the groundwork for real progress is laid. In the end, agreements are signed by governments, but they are shaped by relationships. One of the most revealing aspects of leadership is not how someone performs when everything goes according to plan, but how they respond when it doesn't. Schedules fall apart, negotiations stall, headlines shift unexpectedly, crises emerge without warning. In those moments, titles offer no protection, only character does. I have had the privilege of witnessing leaders under extraordinary pressure, moments when the stakes were global and the margin for error was painfully small. And what stands out to me is not dramatic speeches or bold declarations, but the quiet resilience shown in unscripted moments. There was an occasion during an international gathering when a carefully coordinated announcement was interrupted by breaking news from another part of the world. The mood in the room changed instantly. Advisors moved quickly. Phones began to light up. You could feel the shift in energy, from ceremonial to urgent. The leader at the center of that moment had every reason to show visible frustration. Months of preparation were suddenly overshadowed. But instead of reacting with alarm, there was a deliberate pause, a breath, a steady acknowledgement of the new development. Instructions were given calmly. The team reorganized, the focus adjusted, that steadiness set the tone. When a leader remains composed in uncertainty, it stabilizes everyone down them. It allows advisors to think clearly. It signals to allies that the situation is being handled. It reassures citizens who may only see the final outcome but feel the underlying tension. Resilience is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is often expressed through restraint. I have seen leaders receive difficult news mid-meeting, intelligence briefings that change the direction of policy in an instant. There is no script for that, no rehearsal, only judgment and composure. Grace under pressure is not about suppressing emotion. It is about managing it responsibly. It is understanding that while frustration or disappointment may be natural, projecting panic or anger can ripple outward in destabilizing ways. And here is something important. Grace is not weakness. It is discipline. It takes strength to respond thoughtfully when circumstances provoke immediate reaction. It takes maturity to absorb criticism without escalating conflict. It takes confidence to admit uncertainty without losing authority. In high-level diplomacy, unscripted moments reveal far more than prepared remarks. A translation error, a procedural mishap, a pointed question from the press, these are the moments when instinct takes over. I recall a press conference where a journalist asked a sharply phrased question that could easily have been interpreted as accusatory. The room tightened. The tension was palpable. The leader paused, smiled slightly, not dismissively, but with acknowledgement, and answered with clarity and patience rather than defensiveness. That response changed the entire dynamic. What could have become a confrontational exchange became a measured dialogue. Grace transforms potential conflict into constructive conversation. Resilience also shows in persistence. Negotiations that last into the early hours of the morning, agreements that require revisiting the same issue from multiple angles, progress that comes inch by inch rather than in sweeping breakthroughs. I have watched leaders remain engaged through exhaustion, not because they enjoyed the strain, but because they understood the responsibility they carried. They knew that walking away prematurely could cost their nation's opportunity or stability. That endurance is rarely visible to the public. People see the final handshake, the signed document, the official statement. They do not see the hours of revision, the difficult compromises, the moments of doubt overcome. But resilience lives in those unseen efforts. There is also resilience in humility. When a decision does not produce the intended outcome, when a policy faces unforeseen challenges, the willingness to reassess, to adapt, to course correct, that too is leadership. Perfection is not the standard, accountability is, and in the midst of pressure, leaders who maintain grace remind us that authority does not require aggression. That strength can be steady rather than loud. That composure can coexist with conviction. In our own lives, we encounter our own versions of unscripted moments. Plans unravel, expectations shift. We are tested unexpectedly. The example set by leaders under pressure offers a powerful lesson. How we respond often matters more than what we face. Resilience is not about avoiding difficulty. It is about navigating it with steadiness. Grace is not about denying tension. It is about carrying it responsibly. And when leaders embody those qualities, when they show calm in uncertainty, patience in criticism, and determination in adversity, they demonstrate that true authority is not measured by control over circumstances, but by control over oneself. Because in the most unscripted moments, character speaks louder than any prepared speech. When people ask for a fun story about a world leader, they're often looking for something entertaining, a charming anecdote, a surprising moment, a glimpse behind the curtain. And while those stories can make us smile, what stays with me long after the laughter fades are the lessons embedded within them. Because what we see in those human moments, the humor, the relationships, the resilience, are not qualities reserved for presidents or prime ministers. They are qualities available to all of us. One of the most powerful lessons I've learned from observing leaders up close is that influence is not about perfection. It's about preparation, perspective, and persistence. The leaders who leave a lasting impact are rarely the ones who dominate every room. They are the ones who listen carefully, adapt thoughtfully, and remain grounded in their values. That lesson applies far beyond global diplomacy. You don't need a motorcade or a title to lead. Leadership shows up in classrooms, in small businesses, in community organizations, in families. It shows up when someone takes responsibility instead of waiting for someone else to act. It shows up when someone chooses collaboration over ego. It shows up when someone maintains integrity, even when no one is watching. Watching world leaders navigate pressure has reinforced something deeply encouraging. They are human beings who developed their capacity over time. They were not born knowing how to negotiate complex agreements or handle international crises. They learned, they made mistakes, they grew, and so can you. The ability to connect with others, something so critical in diplomacy, is just as critical in everyday life. When you build trust in your workplace, when you strengthen relationships in your community, when you show empathy in disagreement, you are practicing leadership. You are creating environments where progress becomes possible. The humor we talked about earlier, the ability to find lightness in heavy moments, is something we can all cultivate. Life will present serious challenges. Responsibilities will weigh heavily at times. But maintaining perspective keeps us from becoming overwhelmed by the very problems we are trying to solve. The resilience we've seen in unscripted moments is equally transferable. Plans will fall apart. Unexpected obstacles will arise. Criticism will surface. The question is not whether those moments will come. They will. The question is how we respond. Do we react impulsively, or do we pause and think? Do we let frustration define the moment, or do we demonstrate steadiness? Do we retreat from difficulty, or do we engage it with patience? And perhaps the most important lesson of all is that relationships matter. In global affairs, progress depends on trust built over time. In our own lives, the same principle holds true. Investing in relationships, showing up consistently, listening sincerely, communicating clearly, creates opportunities that authority alone never could. Sometimes people look at world leaders and think, I could never do that. But what they are really seeing is the amplified version of skills they already possess. Communication, empathy, decision-making, adaptability. The difference is scale, not essence. You may never negotiate a treaty between nations, but you will negotiate conflicts in your own life. You may never stand behind a podium with cameras flashing, but you will stand in moments where others look to you for guidance. The examples we see at the highest levels are reminders of what is possible when ordinary human qualities are practiced with discipline and purpose. So when I share a lighthearted story about a world leader joking about homework or weather mishaps, I'm not just sharing something amusing, I'm reminding you that leadership is not distant or mystical. It is human. It is practiced, it is accessible. You don't have to wait for a title to begin leading. You don't have to be perfect to earn respect. You don't have to eliminate uncertainty to move forward. What you need is integrity. What you need is persistence. What you need is the willingness to stay grounded in your humanity while rising to meet responsibility. The people shaping global decisions are not defined solely by their offices. They are defined by their character. And character is something every one of us can build. Because at its core, leadership is not about power. It is about the courage to show up, connect, and carry responsibility with grace.